Welcome to the 10X Blueprint Podcast, your guide to unlocking 10X growth through AI, AR, and Web3. Join Simone Knight, billion-dollar media strategist and founder of Brandiverse Marketing, for discussions with industry leaders about harnessing the power of tomorrow's technologies today. Let's step into the Brandiverse. Welcome to this week's episode of the 10X Blueprint Podcast. My name is Simone Knight, and I'm your host. This week on the podcast, we have Mr. Donald Farmer. Donald is a seasoned data analytics strategist. He is the head and principal of Treehive Strategy. He's also the VP of Innovation at Nobody Studios. So Donald has an illustrious career working with some big names like leadership roles at Qlik Technologies, Microsoft. He works with global corporations, and he's an accomplished author and speaker. And really, he's a really interesting person. He has a home also that is filled with woodland creatures and featured on a show that you may recognize on the Animal Planet called Treehouse Masters. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the Treehive beehive that is also on Donald's property. So Donald, please join us on the podcast. How are you?
I am great. Thank you so much for having me.
So Donald, you and I met years ago, actually back in 2018. We were working on a project together. We were hosting an online web series with Domo, which is another data analytics SaaS platform. And we were hosting what can be considered a type of podcast, but it was 8-week episodes of different conversations with leaders around data analytics, right?
That's right. Yeah, and that was really fun. We had, I think, about 3 people on each call, and we did about 8 or 10 of them. And it was really good to have deep conversations with people, such a wide variety of people too. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, we kind of did like a masterpiece theater where I introduced the topic and gave some background. And then you were the interviewer of these illustrious, like deep people in leadership roles across the country and across the globe, really. And that was really fun. So anyone who has not seen that, you can Google that and find the Domo episodes on that. We'll circle back on that later on in the conversation. So let's get into knowing a little bit more about you, Donald. So you live near Seattle with your family.
I do.
And I would love to understand, what are some things that you love about living in Seattle?
The great thing about living in Seattle, the really good thing is this is an amazing state that we live in Washington. I can be in the mountains. I can be in the forest. I can be on the islands. I go a bit further. I can be in desert, like 90 minutes away. There's tumbleweed and rattlesnake desert. It's incredible. There's so much variety. And yet you're here in this very nice little town close to a major tech center. I can fly to Asia Pacific directly. I can fly to Europe directly. I can fly down to Silicon Valley in a day. So it's amazingly accessible, and it's a beautiful area, quite stunning landscape. And yeah, you could tell I love it here. I could go on.
That part of the country is very, very beautiful. And the landscapes in particular appeal to me. Some of you that are maybe watching this podcast may notice that my background is different because I too am in the mountains right now. I'm in the Georgia Blue Ridge Mountains and have my beautiful brick fireplace here behind me. And so I love the whole feel of the outdoors and being up in the mountains and the trees and the woodland creatures, as you mentioned. And so you're experiencing that on the West Coast, the Pacific Northwest, and I'm over here in the Southeast. So literally the opposite end of the country, and really enjoying a similar type of environment. So we talked a little bit about the beehive Treehive. Why don't you explain to everybody what that is before we go into it?
Well, so it's a treehouse, but it's a rather different treehouse. My wife was interested in building a treehouse ever since she was a little girl, and she wanted something that looked natural. Not just like a cabin stuck in a tree, but something that looked like a natural object that had grown out of the tree. And so she did some sketches, and Pete Nelson of Treehouse Masters, the TV show, he built it. And it was quite stunning. It's a beautiful, beautiful object. You can see if you search for beehive treehouse or beehive treehive online, you can see pictures of it. And it, I didn't design it. I didn't build it. It's just a beautiful place to hang out.
You loved it so much that you named your company about it, right? You named
Exactly,
your company Treehouse Strategy. It is gorgeous, and that circular shape or more like a cylindrical shape, I suppose, right? It's a really cool thing to behold.
Spiral staircase going up to it. It looks maybe like a wasp nest, a yellow jacket nest, or a beehive in the trees. Yeah, it really is quite something.
So, I mean, I'm a little bit jelly about the Treehouse because every time I watch that show, Treehouse Masters, I'm like, oh my God, I would love to have one of those tree houses. What would you say is like sort of most special about having a tree house like that? What do you use it for?
Oh, that's great. I use it as my thinking space. That's where I
Ah,
go. I've deliberately got my Wi-Fi routers and extenders arranged so that they don't reach the treehouse, so I can go there and be cut off. I live near Seattle. I live 20 minutes from Microsoft campus and
mhm.
20 minutes from Google and Amazon. And yet I can go up there and be completely isolated. I'm up in the trees. I could be anywhere. And it's a tremendously peaceful place. It's built around a single tree. It's beautifully enclosed in the woods. And it's just a tremendously relaxing place. There's a hammock in it. I can go and snooze. So it's where I go to think and where I go to get some space that I need.
I love, love, love that. That's what I'm doing up here in the Georgia Mountains too. I'm thinking and getting some
Right.
space. This is a great time of year for anyone to get out and be in nature and sort of recharge. And as people talk more and more about mental health and innovation and sort of repositioning or reframing your perspective, these types of environments become more and more important to us, I think. So I'm glad that you have that space. So let's talk about another beautiful environment. So you are a Scotsman. You are from the Scottish Highlands. So, what do you miss most about being in the Scottish Highlands versus being in the United States?
Well, naturally, I miss my son who moved back there. He moved back there with his family. So I miss
Mhm,
them. He works in the Scotch whiskey industry. So that's pretty exciting.
mhm,
For a Scotsman, that's like a peak of achievement. The other thing I really miss, when I said I love the landscape here, and the landscape of Scotland is beautiful and different. What I have in Scotland, which I don't have here, is history. Absolute history. We lived in a house in Scotland before we moved to Seattle. Our house in Scotland was rebuilt, not built, but rebuilt in 1715 after it had burned down. So, I mean, it was hundreds of years old. And the church behind our house was 1,000 years old. And that's just the village we were living in. The village where my son lives now is, there's buildings in there that go back 300, 400, 500 years. And that sense of history, that sense of living history, you have it in the US, but it goes back, 100, 200 years. And if you're Native American, you have some history that goes back a bit further. There's a place I go for meditation retreats, which is built on an old Native American kind of summer camp where they would spend their summers on the coast. And it's a very beautiful place. So they have some connection to that history, but I don't. Everything that I know was built, the town where I am, just probably first people probably settled here in maybe the 1880s. So it's really not that old. So I really miss the sense of living history that I have in Scotland. But, I'm creating a new history here. We're part of a new environment. That's also exciting and different.
Fantastic. I've heard so many people talk about the history of Europe, right? When you're walking around, like you said, you're surrounded by it all the time with these gorgeous buildings and the architecture is amazing. You see a lot of that when people visit Italy. You see it a lot of that when people visit Greece and Turkey and places like that. And the United States is a relatively young country in comparison. I think we're teenagers in comparison to Europe. So our history is definitely a different look and a different feel. So what an interesting response. I have a friend who is a real history buff, and I think he would love to probably sit down and have a conversation with you about some things like that. But alas, we are not here to talk about that today. Today, we are going to talk about AI literacy and data analytics strategy, right? Now, some of you may be thinking, okay, what does one have to do with the other? And the answer is a lot, because for you to become really a business leader in AI, for your company to really use it as a competitive advantage, a strong data strategy is also required. You have to have the right technology stack, you have to have the right governance, and you have to have your data set up correctly so that you can leverage the collective intelligence of the organization over time using AI. You can aggregate the right information and really put together puzzle pieces that are going to be the foundation for your consumer engagement, for your technological innovation, for your data advancement and innovation in terms of new products. So let's get into that a little bit. So, Donald, please talk about, for instance, what is AI literacy before we really get into that? Because this is an area that you really decided to focus your career in, taking your knowledge of data analytics and moving it into AI strategy and AI literacy and really helping companies gain this type of knowledge. So, can you explain what that is a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think literacy is incredibly important. And I put some books behind me, and they're real books. These are not a micro. I think I'm literate. Literacy involves three things. It involves, first of all, vocabulary, knowing the words. You have to basically know the terms that people are using. So there's that part of literacy. There's the ability to read, which is the ability to take in information. And there is ability to write, which is the ability to synthesize information. So AI literacy actually follows the same pattern. We have to understand the vocabulary. And so if you are hoping to work with AI, or if you're hoping to work in AI, or if you're an executive managing a team which is using AI, there's things you've got to know. You've got to know what AI is. You've got to probably know what the difference is between Gen AI and AI. You might need to know what people mean when they talk about a model or an algorithm. There's vocabulary you need to know. You need to be able to understand, which is equivalent of reading. When people are talking about it, you need to be able to analyze what's going on in the sense of being able to at least understand if somebody says we'd like to host our model in the cloud, or we'd like to host our model on premises, or we'd like to use a small model or a large model. You need to be able to understand what that means and analyze that situation. And then you need to be able to synthesize, which is equivalent to writing, which is you need to be able to come up with your own ideas, your own new ideas that you can bring to the subject. So really, AI literacy is about those three things. Do you have the vocabulary? Do you understand what people are talking about? Not necessarily in great depth, but to the level that's relevant and appropriate for your position. Are you able to analyze and understand the concepts and put them together and make sense of them? And then are you able to articulate and be able to have that conversation, that creative conversation, which is the equivalent of writing? So that's why I call it literacy. And those three kind of components have to work together.
I love that. And I don't think, as the industry in general sort of lands on where it is trying to go with AI, I don't think people really think about all of these specific components and how they tie together to create a roadmap or help them develop a roadmap that will be the future foundation of the business. So I love that you've broken it down into those components and are really helping leaders move through that. So, let's go a little deeper into that. So, how would you
Mm.
see the role of AI really evolving, not just from like a tech strategy or even market strategy, but to a business strategy?
Right. This becomes super interesting, I think. There's a lot of discussion in the market just now about where AI is going
Hmm.
and how AI is getting there and what are the latest developments. And Apple made announcements about Apple Intelligence, and OpenAI are doing things, and Amazon, everybody's doing something. And so we get very caught up in the incremental steps that we're taking right now. And we could talk about what's going to happen in the next year or what's going to happen in the next 2 years. I'm old enough now that I've got bifocal glasses. So if I have the near vision and I'm talking about what's happening in the next 1 or 2 years, there's all sorts of interesting things you could say about what ChatGPT is doing and what Microsoft and things are doing and what's going to happen next. But if I look over the top of my glasses and take the long view and take the long vision, my granddaughters are 3 and 4 years old. One of them's just about to start school, I guess, when she's 5. By the time they leave high school, they will live in a world where AI is super intelligent, where AI is beyond what we can imagine today. And we know it's getting there. We've already passed the first tipping point of AI towards functionality that was a dream 20 years ago. By the time they come out of high school, it will be an AI world.
Mm.
So if we'll take that longer prospect, where is AI going? AI is going everywhere you can imagine it going. And it's going there very, very rapidly.
Hmm.
So in terms of business strategy, we have to think, of course, we have to think in business terms, what's going to happen over the next 2, 3 years, because they affect our immediate budget and our immediate plans and our immediate tactics. Strategically and thinking in the long term, we just have to assume that AI is going to be as competent as we can imagine it to be. And that's actually quite a thought. That's quite an eye-opening thought. But our strategy has to, I think, take that into account. It's happening. It's happening now. And no point in resisting it. We have to learn how to adapt to that.
What would you say are some of the biggest challenges you see companies facing right now with, turning AI into a business strategy?
Right. Well, the first challenge is the lack of literacy. And by that, I don't mean the lack of expertise, which is a bit different. You can find AI experts, you can go out and find developers. And right now, every machine learning, every AI course at every university in the country in the US is oversubscribed. So even if you can't find people now, you're going to be able to find people in the next 2, 3 years. The expertise, the people who really know how to do this, the developers, you will be able to find those skills. That's not really the issue. The issue is, how do you raise the overall level of literacy of the entire organization so that everybody in the business is aware of what AI can do, is aware of how they can use AI, and is also aware of limitations of AI. There's a big difference. Literacy, and this is one of the reasons I talk about literacy so much. If you think back in the Middle Ages, there were a few people who were literate. There were some priests and scribes and so on who could read and write. And so there was an elite. There was an elite of people who were literate. Come the 19th century, come the 20th century, you have mass literacy, where everyone is now able, to a certain extent, to read and write. And if you can't, you're at a tremendous disadvantage. And so there's a big difference between having an elite who are highly literate and a mass of people who are literate enough to make a huge difference in their lives. And that's where we are with AI. Just now, there's an elite who are literate, and we need to bring the mass of people in your organization. And that means you need to think of your organization not just having a few AI experts. You'll be able to get them. Pay enough money, you can get the AI experts. But how do you raise the understanding and the knowledge of the entire business so that's functioning? That's a major part of strategy. So I think that's actually a really important step to take.
I love when you say that. It's funny because I'm actually starting an education series on AI for the general staff because I know that there's a lot of excitement about artificial intelligence in organizations, but there's still a lot of lack of knowledge as to how to move forward. And of course, some apprehension in terms of some of the challenges that you're facing and data security and just so many things going too far, too fast. And those are all very valid concerns. And that's why I thought to myself, I'm helping companies modernize their marketing with AI. And it would make sense to also bring in some educational series for the different levels that they need to go through to create this AI literacy that you're talking about. So this
Absolutely.
this leads me into the next question is how do you help companies from falling victim to AI, right? Because there's a lot of traps out there. There's a lot of death traps out there, as you well know, Donald.
There are two ways to fall victim to AI. And the first way is not to use it. The first is
Oh,
to
wait,
fall
wait, no.
behind.
You got to repeat that. You have to repeat that. The first way is to not use it. That's the first death
Exactly.
trap.
Yeah, that's the first death trap, because if everybody else is using it and you're not, then you're at a disadvantage. So you cannot be an AI denial. That is the big death trap, being an AI denial when everybody else is actually making progress. So you got to try it. We should talk about how you can get started. I think that's useful. The other way, of course, is then to not understand the types of errors that can occur in your business, the types of things that can go wrong. And I have to say, one of the things we have to develop in AI literacy and in the AI business in general, we need to be much more articulate about what can go wrong, the things can go wrong. And people have some vague understanding of, oh, there are hallucinations, there are deep fakes, there are things like that. We know some of that vocabulary, but does anybody actually really know what an AI hallucination is? Are you really going to be articulate about that? So if you're a business person and you're planning your marketing strategy, what could go wrong?
Mhm.
What's the taxonomy of things that can go wrong? Now, I could tell you, if you're doing a marketing strategy with human beings, what could go wrong? Do you know what can go wrong in a marketing strategy in human beings? Could you actually sit down and say, here's our strategy. Let's write a page at the end of this proposal, which is all the things that could go wrong. Do we ever do that? No, we don't.
As a project manager, I'm saying that you are absolutely right because there's supposed to be a risk management plan, but there isn't.
Right, exactly. We don't have a risk management plan. So, we need to know how to write that risk management plan. And if you don't know how to write it, and that's an important part of AI literacy, understanding what can go wrong, then that's the other danger. So the first danger is not doing it, and the second danger is not understanding the potential downsides of it. I think those are the two real dangers there.
Yeah, so just giving a little bit more meat to what you're saying in terms of the dangers, guidelines, right? What are the guidelines in terms of what information you should use? How do you check the information? Governance, right? What are the rules about how and when and why you should be using it? What systems we're tapping into? Do you have systems, generative AI systems that are customized for your business where you're generating content and information from the data, again, the word data, that it already exists within your company? Or basically, is it a closed loop? Or are you going out of house to enrich that information and bringing it in? So there's definitely got to be some guidelines and governance around that. And then, ooh, Donald, let's talk about the E word, ethics. Ethics.
Yeah, ethics is such an interesting area when it comes to AI. So I think of course, there's a lot of discussion about AI ethics just now, but I think it should open our eyes to our existing ethics. You're
Mm.
not going to get a handle on AI ethics unless you have a good understanding of what your existing ethics are. What are your non-AI ethics? What are your ethics? What is the ethos of your company? So, I mean, think about brand. What is the ethos of your brand? And there's a lot of things that we could talk about in terms of brand ethos. We could talk about sustainability. We could talk about equity. We could talk about inclusion. There's lots of things that you might think about in a brand. I mean, famously, Google had an ethical brand, "Don't be evil," and now they're whatever, selling military drones to whoever would buy them. At some point, you have to understand your existing ethics, your existing ethical ethos of your brand. And again, this comes down to something very similar to the risk management. We all know that's what's needed, but we don't necessarily do it. So if you don't have an existing ethical standard, if you don't have an existing ethos, how are you going to create one for AI? You've got to build on something. And if you don't have one today, you better think about your existing ethics before you start thinking about your AI ethics. And then the question isn't what should our AI ethics be? It is how do our AI ethics fulfill our existing ethical standards? And that's a different question. And to be honest, that's a slightly easier question rather than what should AI ethics be from scratch. So I think that's important.
I love that because I'll be honest with you, I don't often see ethics listed as part of the values of a particular company, right? And this word with ethics and AI has been really tossed around a lot over the past year or so because there's a motto that says, just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? Just
Right.
because you can doesn't mean you should. And you have certain key players that are trying to reduce the speed at which we are developing AI because it's like, a kid running with scissors. It's possible that you can get through with the gauntlet without getting hurt, but chances are there will be some blood running, right? So you've got to like really think about that. And I love what you said about first developing your own company's ethics. And then you add in the AI after that. And I think that really sets people on a different path. And quite frankly, it's much more doable. It's much more reasonable, I think, as an ask. You don't have to lock
Exactly.
yourself in a room for like a whole week to come up with something like that. I think you already have your values, or you should, hint, hint, you should already have your business values.
Exactly.
And then you apply the ethics and then you apply AI.
And there may be some AI specific things. I'll give you an example of an AI specific thing. I think people should be told when they're interacting with AI. If I am on a chatbot and I'm trying to book an airline ticket or something, I think I would, or I'm trying to rebook an airline ticket, that sort of thing, where you call customer service or you chat with customer service. I would like to know if that's an AI I'm dealing with or if it's a human being I'm dealing with.
I think that that's a good point because sometimes you respond in a way that it's kind of cold, or you get a response that doesn't really make complete sense, or you feel like perhaps the chatbot isn't responding or the person in the chat is not responding. So if you realize that this is an AI, I think you have different expectations of that conversation, different
Exactly.
levels of empathy that you may be dealing with, for instance, a travel situation, a travel emergency where your luggage is lost, or maybe your child's favorite toy was left behind in an airplane
Exactly.
seat. Things like that where are not critical, but from a human perspective, it's important to the person's feelings and their emotions and how they feel about your brand, right? And at the end of the day, a
Totally.
brand is based on how people feel about you, your company, when they hear your name, when they interact with you. So I like what you said about knowing that you're interacting with an AI. And of course, I've seen now on social media where if people are posting an image that is an AI image, that there is a sort of a little line of text there on the bottom that says, artificial intelligence generated or something like that. It's kind of like the requirement to mark food products with GMO, right? Genetically modified organism or genetically engineered food item. So I think we are at that point where those types of labels are required, one, to set the expectation from the consumer, but also from an ethical perspective. So you understand this picture is not real. This amazing picture of me in the background in the mountains is not real. No, I'm kidding. It is real. But there's so many things like right now, Facebook and other social platforms are flooded with images of stars at the Met Gala that happened a month or so ago. And these are some amazing images of outfits and so forth, one of the biggest events in fashion. But a lot of that stuff isn't true. It's not a real image. It's
Correct.
completely AI generated. So you're like, oh my God, look at this amazing outfit. No, it's not real. So I love what you said about, first of all, knowing that you're interacting with AI as one of the things that would be part of that ethical guideline that you would write. Any other recommendations for incorporating AI in your ethics?
Well, one thing that follows from knowing that it's AI is, and this comes up a lot when we talk about AI ethics, is explainability. If you know you're interacting with an AI and an AI is making decisions, how do you know why it made that decision? If an AI is deciding whether or not you get a car loan, how do you know what the basis of that decision is? And I think there are sort of three answers to that. One answer is there may be an algorithm that you can explain to someone. You can literally say, we went through these mathematical steps, and this is why you didn't score high enough to get the loan. And that is entirely explainable, and you could run through that process for anyone. Whether or not you understand the explanation is a different matter, but it's explainable. A second approach is sort of relative, which is to say you fall into this category of people who are, we can't exactly say what the algorithm was, what the weighting was, but 90% of the time you were not going to get a loan. 90% of the people with these characteristics didn't get a loan. So you kind of fall into that 90%, something like that. So it's a relative explanation. You are like these other people, would be one way of doing it. The third approach is in some ways unsatisfactory if you want a perfect explanation, but it's actually a very human approach, which is you start to think about the AI almost like another human being. After all, think of in the old days when you had to go to a bank manager and ask for a loan. How did they make the decision? What's going on in their head? They had a falling out with their husband, or they were indigestion, or they were worried about their kid at school. Maybe they had a completely different attitude that day. And you came in and asked for a car loan, and they're just in a bad mood. And who knows what's going on there? Now, there's been lots of cognitive studies by neurologists about how people make decisions. And we can't explain how human beings make a decision. We can't explain necessarily how AI makes a decision. But if you've used AI and you use it extensively, you get to know, you get to get a feel for it. You get to know the kind of answers it's going to give. Very often now, when I ask ChatGPT to write something or I ask it a question, I kind of know how it's going to phrase the answer. It's almost like I'm getting to know it as a personality. And, you don't like the personality, but it's a personality. And I think that's what we're getting close to now.
I think that's interesting you said about when you use generative AI and Chat GPT in particular, you kind of understand sort of a way it's going to respond. I feel that way when I read some people's content online and I'm
Yeah.
5 seconds, I know I'm like, okay, this is AI generated because I've just been so well versed in terms of what this looks like and what it sounds like. It's just like, okay, yeah, that's not you. You did it right. So, public service announcement, people: when AI gives you something, please make it your own. Please put it in your own voice. Remove some of the extra emojis. Public service announcement. Okay. So I wanted to just talk a lot about some very, very important things, Donald, and I want to double click on them in terms of ethics. When you mentioned explainability in the decisions that AI is coming up with, because let's face it, from a financial services, healthcare services, so many different reasons, AI definitely is being used to aggregate data and make decisions that impact real people's everyday lives. You mentioned some really great ones: deciding whether or not you get a business loan, a car loan, a home loan. How about college admissions? And whether or not you may be getting an interview for a job or even getting the job. And these things affect the lives of real people. And we know that in the past, you've heard the saying, garbage in, garbage out, right? So if your data is already skewed and you use that data to create an AI model, guess what's going to happen with your model, right? So if you're only
sure.
looking at data from a certain group of people that are more likely to get a loan or get a green light and whatever the decision is from your business, and you're saying, okay, well, these are the people that we have over the past 20 years have gotten a yes, or gotten a green light. We're going to feed that data into our AI model and we're going to do that. But if that data was already skewed by human beings making that decision, now your model is going to be skewed in perpetuity. And I know that there are some organizations out there that are auditing these systems and looking for, perhaps inherent bias that was fed into the model, not necessarily on purpose, but it happens that way. And as the world becomes more and more AI focused and AI driven, What you're saying is really key. So, what are some red flags that maybe you've come across and maybe you've helped clients realize are happening in their systems that could be potential signs of a problem?
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's such an interesting and important area. And it's one of the reasons that I said earlier that if you want to approach AI ethics, you first of all have to understand your existing ethics. If you don't have an existing set of criteria by which you want to judge ethical status of a system, how are you going to apply anything to AI? You can't invent it from scratch. And then let me give you an interesting example of that, a real example. I will not name names, but I was working with a company that did automated hiring. Very, very interesting process. It was a new algorithm. They were very committed to really trying to create an effective automated hiring system. They do packaging of items that generally get shipped in from China and get repackaged into different sort of gift boxes and things like that. And it's very seasonal. So at certain times of year, they have to hire large numbers of people. And they base it on what they've seen before, who turned out to be good, who turned out to be bad, and things like that. Now, in order not to be biased, using that word, and we'll come back to bias, but in order not to be biased, they made sure there were certain questions they didn't ask. You're not going to take account of race. We're not going to take account of gender. We're just going to ask people about, there's a certain amount of information you need to collect in the application form, but we won't feed that into the algorithm. The algorithm will be based without those things. It was great. Seemed to work really well. Managers and so on were quite happy with the hires. The first season that they ran, it looked like a good system. And we had a brown bag meeting with the managers later to discuss how did the system go. And it went really well. We talked about it. People were pretty happy. And we get to the end of this sort of 1 hour brown bag lunch meeting with the managers. Said, any other questions, any observations? And woman put her hand up and said, "Well, I have an observation. I said my daughter is a single mother, and I'm very sensitive to the needs of single mothers, and I know that they need sometimes a little bit of flexibility on their shifts and their timing and things like that. I don't have any single mothers in my shift this year." She was a shift manager. "I don't have any single mothers. I just noticed it, but I wonder if that's got anything to do with the algorithm." Well, he said, "Oh, no, it can't possibly, because we're not even looking at gender. We're not looking at asking number two. We're not looking at any of those things." And then it was like that movie Spartacus, "I'm Spartacus, I'm Spartacus." Hands went up all over the room. "I don't have any single mothers. I don't have any single mothers. No, neither do I." We had not hired throughout the entire season, maybe one or two single mothers out of the entire system. And yet nothing was in the algorithm that would have missed that. So what happened? Well, it turns out that when you ask people when people go through the automated process of applying for the job, they say what shifts they want and they say what shifts they can't work. And there was 3 levels of question. There was, "I definitely want to work this shift. I definitely cannot work this shift. And I am flexible about this shift." And there are, whatever there were, 21 shifts in a week. You know what? Single mothers are extremely careful about the shifts they work. They have to be, because they have childcare to worry about. And it turns out that the algorithm rejected people who were rigid about the shifts. The algorithm wants people who are flexible with shifts because that fits into the system better. So the algorithm was rejecting single mothers, even though there was nothing about single mothers in the data. We weren't even collecting gender.
So really, it was rejecting the rigid behavior, the rigid
Right.
requirement. That's what it was
Which
rejecting.
became a proxy for, single. And I should say single parent, but single mother was the phrase that was used, and it was actually and that was the case that came up. So it became a proxy, even though it wasn't in the data. Now, here's 2 interesting things that I think are important about this. We only spotted that after we'd run the algorithm. The only reason we spotted it after we run the algorithm was because human beings put their hand up, and said that this isn't working. How would we have stopped it doing that? How would we have stopped the algorithm from doing that? How could we possibly have worked out that shifts were a proxy? Now that I say it, it's obvious, isn't it? And it's kind of clear. But how would we have known that in advance? The only way we'd have picked that up in advance is if we had already articulated our preferences, our ethics. If we'd actually had a clear definition, we will not discriminate against single parents. Therefore, we'll run tests just in the same way as we test for performance and scale and security and accuracy. We should test for biases. And this is something that I think is very important when we talk about bias. When I say that this algorithm has bias, so there's bias in this system, there's bias in this hiring system, there's bias in this insurance system, there's bias in this car loan system, you immediately think of negative bias. It's biased against people. But actually, all systems are biased. That's why we have them. If you have a car insurance system, it's biased against bad drivers and is biased in favor of good. You don't want bad drivers.
That is true.
Yeah. So so bias isn't, bias is a question of the things that we want and the things that we don't want. It's not just the things that we don't want. Sometimes we use this language of bias always to mean negative, but actually there's positive bias. We want good drivers. We want people who are going to repay their loan. We want people who are going to be good workers. So all we have to do is articulate the biases. These are the things that we want. These are the things that we don't want, and we have to test for them. We have to build it into our testing process, not wait until somebody puts their hands up and says, well, actually. And by the way, the same company that did this hiring, when we went back and we
Mhm.
said, what are the biases that we're worried about? What are the positive biases we want? We found another one. It wasn't quite as marked, it wasn't quite as serious, but it was that people from certain zip codes tended to be later to work, had more tardies on their shift than people who lived in other zip codes. And guess what? In the city that this company was based in, different minorities live in different zip codes. It wasn't as marked, but you know, you start discriminating against a minority because they live in a zip code where the public transport isn't so good. So therefore, they are more likely to be tardy to work. That's a bias you don't want. But how do you detect that unless you have already articulated?
Donald, you were just bringing up a whole host of thoughts in my mind on this because as an engineer, my mind is saying that, okay, if I was part of this process of coming up with this algorithm that was going to create this product of automated hiring, right? And you're thinking, okay, what do you want the system to do, right? And what do you not want it to do, et cetera? I'm going to go back to the whole thing about single mothers, right? So it's
Right.
great that right up front, someone was smart enough to say, well, yeah, we're not going to use gender, we're not going to use race. Okay, so that's going to get rid of a whole lot of biases right off the bat. So kudos to the team for coming up with that. But what is likely to happen is in the area of flexibility, you are likely to tell the system to rank the flexibility level, right? Which is definitely will work, definitely will not work, and flexibility. And that is the key because oftentimes that is how the system is designed because you want the most flexibility for the
Right.
workforce that you're hiring. So essentially, you are designing in a bias that will ultimately detrimentally affect a certain group of people that are
Yeah.
single parents, as you said, right? Not necessarily single mothers, but
Yeah.
chances are there are more single mothers than there are single fathers, right? So that's a really deep thing to have to go back and really think about in the design process up front. So now you have to think not just two-dimensionally or three-dimensionally, probably even many more dimensions to say, okay, if we design this as a key flexible thing that is going to be rewarded in our design process, who, now putting a persona to this, who
Yeah.
might this affect negatively? And I don't know that a lot of companies are actually doing that extra step, right?
They absolutely are not. And this is why I want to suggest that, yes, there's a good discussion to be had about AI ethics, but we first of all have to understand our existing ethics.
Yeah.
And then the AI ethic problem actually becomes a little easier because now you're applying it to an existing standard that you have. Not enough companies think about their existing ethical standards in a way that can be articulated and in a way which can be encoded. That's really the difference.
As we're talking about AI's role in our business strategy, and talking about the role of ethics, let's talk about AI as a team member, right? Could
Yeah.
AI be a team member? And how would you use ethics to design in the values of what that AI team member is for your organization?
Well, I said, that one of the ways to think about AI, one of the ways to try and understand it, we're understanding it algorithmically, understanding it mathematically is beyond most people. And not only that, it's actually beyond people who design it. Most of them don't really know how the systems surprise them with what they can do. And so there's this emergent property of technology that you build something, but you really don't know what it's capable of, and you really don't know, in some ways and sense, you don't really know how it works, or you don't know what's coming out of that. So one of the only ways that you can think about AI is to think about AI in terms, almost in human terms. It's another intelligence, maybe not in human terms. Let's start thinking of it as another intelligence. I suspect that one of the ways we're going to have to deal with this in the future is by regarding AI as another intelligence which joins our team. And so now we're going to have to think about how do we onboard AI? It's the onboarding process for an AI. That is the way in which we will think about it. I'm always willing to put a bet on it that HR departments who are currently human resources and or human capital departments are going to become AI resource departments. How do we onboard these AIs? And we will onboard them for different purposes. You'll have AIs which are used for writing code. You'll have AIs which are in customer service. You'll have AIs which are doing strategy, and you will onboard them with different standards, or maybe with one corporate standard, but with different focuses and different capabilities. And I literally think we'll be onboarding AIs in the same way as we onboard human beings today. Quite a thought.
Yeah, for sure. It is definitely a major thought. And I think we're headed there. We're headed there a lot faster than
Oh,
people realize, right? Because now you're looking at an AI persona. And I think from a marketing perspective, right? Because this is my business, right? Marketing strategy is my area of focus. And I can see from a branding perspective, you can create an AI persona for each of your different target markets, imbue them with certain values, certain requirements, and certain needs. And as you roll out new products, you basically use that persona to identify the probability of acceptance and adoption over time, or how a particular group of people may respond in terms of the rate of consumption of that particular product. And
for sure.
bringing in these values and the ethics and all of these things are part of that. And you're right, that role may end up in HR in terms of helping to figure out what that persona could look like, from when it comes to a persona that is perhaps an employee based persona, depending upon what your product is that you're talking about. So, moving on a little bit in terms of this, do you think that we are at an AI tipping point where we are now to the point where we are not going to be able to live without AI?
Yes. I mean, that's a very short answer, is yes. And we've already passed that tipping point. The genie is not going back in the bottle. It has already happened. I think there's a couple of other tipping points still to come, though. And the biggest tipping point is the tipping point of autonomy, when systems can actually start acting entirely without human intervention. Just now, you
Mm,
ask AI to do things, it will do it. So today, for example, I'm sure we're all using AI to write stuff. And as you say, it's all very cliched and we have to edit it. At least I hope we edit it. But we all use AI to write copy, for example. But we tell the AI what copy to write. At some point, the AI will be autonomous enough when you can just say, well, I've got a new product, go create a campaign, go deal with all the copy, go deal with all the social media and things like that. And that level of autonomy is going to be another tipping point where we can, it's generic enough, it's general enough in its intelligence that it can actually do those things. Today, when you ask it to do something specific, it can do it. At some point, probably over the next kind of 3, 4, or 5 years, it'll be generally intelligent enough that you can give it a strategy, give it a strategic goal, and let it work out everything that needs to happen to achieve that strategy. That'll be when it becomes autonomous.
I love it. So that's definitely going back to it becoming a part of your staff, right? AI becomes
Right.
a role that maybe, it augments the marketing manager role, which is, or the marketing director role. Go ahead and create the strategy. We're going to review it. Okay, go ahead and implement this with these components, the media buying, the creative design, the so and so. But at the end of the day, even if AI starts to augment your marketing and branding staff in this way, there is still that human component of coming up with the idea of what's needed and coming up with perhaps a new approach that is really based on what's happening in pop culture. Because you may be coming from a perspective of, for instance, entertainment. If you are creating an entertainment campaign that is supposed to be part of an award show or a movie launch or something like that, the movie is not yet out there in the world, so the AI doesn't know about that, right? And the movie doesn't know yet who you're trying to target yet. And so, there is still this component as to something that may be a brand new, small budget, independent film that could just take the world by storm, even though the data on paper says that it's not going to do much. It actually does. And there's a lot of examples of that. You have Stranger Things, which is like a small, low budget show that
Right.
was huge on Netflix. You have Squid Games, which was also same thing, Korean low budget show, huge on Netflix. You have other small budget things that just really, really blow up. The Tiger, what is it, Tiger King? That was also on Netflix. I'm using all these Netflix examples, but there's a lot of
Yeah.
great stuff out there that the data says that it's not a big deal, but human beings love it and really elevate it to another level. And so that human component is always going to be important in your AI strategy. and use the AI for what it's great for: automation, making things faster, better, cheaper. But the human beings will not go away. So, Donald, this has been an amazing conversation. It looks like you wanted to add one more thing. Tell me.
Oh, no, I could add another hour.
I know I could talk for you for a lot more time. All right. So this has been a fascinating conversation. So, Donald, you have a new book that's out right now called Innovating, a short guide to making new things. Tell us about that book.
Well, I've been teaching innovation strategy for quite a long time. And
Right.
I've worked in innovation in all sorts of corporate contexts, from companies as large as Microsoft right down to startups. And I've developed some techniques over the years. And one of the things that I'm really focused on in innovation is that innovation is a practice. It's
Mm,
actually something that you can do. You can learn to innovate, and you can learn to innovate better. The book is very much focused on that. It's how do you innovate? What does it mean to innovate? And how do you innovate better? And I think that's something which sometimes we think of innovation as being like inspiration. It's something that just kind of magically happens and then we manage the process. Or we think of innovation as being somewhat mechanical in an economic sense. It's just about creating incrementally better products. I actually think that the inspirational, the breakthrough innovations can be taught. You can teach people to innovate. And that's what I do in my workshops. And that's what I help people to do, hopefully, through the book.
well, thank you. I mean, the thinking just in this 50 minutes or so that we've been talking is amazing about ethics and AI and personas and values and building in all of those things and how to remove bias from your AI design strategy. I think is fantastic. I encourage everybody to go and check out your book. So I'm assuming your book is on Amazon, available for sale.
It is, yeah.
All right, fantastic. You guys can also go check out the work that Donald and I have done together with Domo. You can check out the Domo Curiosity series. It's about doing data differently. And that is, again, interviews with world renowned leaders in data and AI and SaaS and so forth, and see what we're talking about there. We covered a lot of different ground in terms of building up your data strategy, which would really help in terms of your thinking for implementing your AI strategy going forward. You can find the Domo Curiosity series at domo.com/curiosity. You can check that out. If you love this podcast, I encourage you to like, share, subscribe. We're on all social media at Brand Diverse Marketing. And you can also just follow the hashtag 10X Blueprint podcast. So thank you all for joining us this week. And I look forward to seeing you again next week on the 10X Blueprint podcast. Have a great day. Thank you for joining us on the 10X Blueprint podcast. If you found today's episode inspiring and want to stay ahead of the curve on the latest trends in AI, AR, and Web3, be sure to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on LinkedIn and YouTube at Brand Diverse Marketing. Together, we'll unlock the blueprint for 10X growth. Don't miss out on our next episode, and until then, onward and upward.